coming to this meeting together out of concern for our children, our students, and with heavy hearts, and seeking expertise from those who have worked with us in recent weeks, and who will help us to talk about the grief that we're seeing in the young people in our community, and also with a special focus tonight on recognizing the signs of mental health struggles in our students and in our children. We thank sincerely our entire parent community for your support, and the community organizations, too many to list here, but who have really been reaching out to us, other school systems reaching out to us, offering support and being here and available to our students outside of the hours of the school day in so many different ways. Tonight, we welcome Frank Bartolomeo from Silver Hill Hospital, Chelsea McGee and Julianne Green from Family Centers. And we welcome all of your expertise on these very, very important topics. Scott McCarthy is here with us as well, and he will share an email address with you in the chat. And following the presentations, he will take that list of questions that you share as they come up during the presentation and present them to our panelists to answer for you. We're so delighted that there are so many of you here, and we felt that that would be the best way to organize those questions for everyone's benefit. So I will turn it over right now to Frank, who will begin the presentation tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. I just want to offer my condolences to the community for yet another loss, and appreciate people being on this call. And I'm a big believer that many can bear loss more easily than one. So back in December of this year, the Surgeon General of the United States warned that there was going to be a devastating mental health crisis among children and adolescents. And this was based on the fact that depression and anxiety among adolescents had already been increasing pretty dramatically prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic intensified a number of those issues, so that currently we have so many kids across the country in need of services, and not enough resources to meet all of those needs. Most therapists in the area have extended waiting lists. A lot of organizations do as well. So we really are dealing with a national public health emergency. You know, some of the more recent research indicated that 4 in 10 adolescents reported having, you know, persistently sad feelings and feeling hopeless. You know, 1 in 5 have, you know, contemplated or thought about suicide. Thinking about suicide, of course, is not the same as attempting it. And I want to talk with you a bit about kind of some of the warning signs. And just as a caveat, just explain that in most cases, there are warning signs or risk factors that we can look at to identify kids who may be at risk. In some rarer circumstances, there are none. And I'll speak to you about both. You know, so generally, you know, some of the risk factors for suicide for adolescents is they have a, you know, 1 or more mental health, you know, disorders. Depression doesn't cause suicide, but it's correlated with it. Sometimes acute life events like losses or death of a parent can be a risk factor. as well as a family history of mental health issues or substance abuse issues, and a family history of suicide. And then another important risk factor is if there have been previous suicide attempts. So some of the warning signs, and this gets a little complicated because many of them are also symptoms of depression. So those can be, changes in eating and sleeping habits, loss of interest in usual activities, withdrawal and isolation, neglecting one's personal appearance, obsession with death and dying, loss of interest in school or schoolwork. These can be warning signs of someone who may be at risk of attempting suicide. Listening for things like, kids saying, I feel like dying, or life has no meaning to me. So these are some of the warning signs that, that can trigger intervention. We have seen in some rarer instances, and particularly this past year, where there are no apparent signs of distress. And of course, this is probably the most fearful thing for any parent to, consider. Where we're seeing it and where it's happened in the past, past 6 months, is that there have been several high-performing collegiate athletes, women, who have committed suicide. One was the goalkeeper at the women's soccer team at Stanford. There was another tennis player, I believe it, James Madison, and another female athlete, I believe the University of Wisconsin. From what I've read, and heard and read about their parents' reports, there were not any indicators that they were in acute distress. And for high-performing athletes, it's not even a lack of resources, because they tend to, the NCAA tends to, provide resources. It's really been an issue of asking for help. And we know that high-performing athletes, are under enormous pressure to perform well, both academically and athletically. And if you think about the qualities and characteristics necessary to become a top athlete, they often don't render themselves to people being willing to ask for help. So if you think about the driven and competitive nature of to be a top athlete, the demandingness, sometimes the demand for perfection, not showing kind of signs of weakness. These can all be things that interfere with someone being able to ask for help and saying that they're under tremendous pressure. Athletes often experience a lot of pressure, because sometimes they feel like the weight of their team or the weight of their community or all kinds of expectations are sitting, on their shoulders. So these tend to be some of the more recent cases where there have not been indicators, at least from what I can see in media reports, of someone under acute distress and kind of suffering silently under, probably enormous pressure. And what we see with people who attempt suicide, there's often what we call a kind of cognitive rigidity, where they don't see any other option. So they often report feeling very trapped, and that either option they're looking at aren't good ones. It may mean, something damaging to themselves, or that could affect others that they care about. So often they feel in a situation where there's no good, at least as they're perceiving it, there are no other options. And they tend to be in a lot of emotional pain. And, suicide is, often the endeavor to be relieved of acute emotional pain. So that's often one of the drivers. So those are kind of, some of the pieces that, both for kids who are showing warning signs, and in some rare situations, kids who appear to be on top of the world and have it all going for them. Those are the kids who tend to suffer more quietly, and as I said, tend to be perfectionistic and very, very driven and demanding, and not having a lot of room to share any vulnerability. I want to talk to you about a couple of errors that very well-meaning parents make when trying to discuss such topics. So the best thing we can do in talking with our children about topics like suicide is to really approach that conversation with curiosity and avoid judgments. There's nothing like a judgment that will shut down a conversation with a kid. So quickly jumping to some kind of judgmental statement like that kid had so much to live for. How could this happen? It's a good question, but those kinds of statements often cut down your ability to have a conversation with your child. And ironically enough, a number of kids I work with from affluent communities often feel quite guilty for being in emotional pain, and will share that with me because they sometimes don't feel entitled to be in emotional pain, and also can look at and say, I have so much I should be grateful for. I have all these opportunities. And so they almost feel worse about feeling badly. And in some well-intentioned efforts to help kids feel better, parents might focus on that. Look at all the things you have to be grateful for. You've got all the opportunities in the world. And those kinds of statements often shut down open communication. And in fact, I would recommend you can ask your kids why they think this is happening. We don't have to have the answers to that. I don't think any of us really know right now what it's so complex. I don't think any of us could really say there's a single factor that's leading to the amount of anguish and hopelessness that we're seeing in kids right now. It's a very complex issue that has both psychological, social, and sociological, factors. So try to approach this with curiosity and listen. And the other thing that I would recommend, parents do, and this is of course very difficult, I would try to avoid anxiety-driven attempts to get them talking. So this is where, and sometimes we have to treat ourselves first. Anxiety is a highly contagious psychophysiological state. It can be quickly transmitted. We probably all have experience with this. And if you approach your child with a great deal of, again, understandable anxiety, and that's driving the conversation, your child is going to experience that. And they're either going to shut down so that they don't get overwhelmed by the anxiety, or they'll slip into a role of trying to reassure you. So what started out as an effort to reassure them, kids will then shift into a mode of trying to be reassuring to you. So it's a very difficult thing, but I think we first have to treat our own anxiety and fears, even though that's difficult, so that we can approach them, again, with curiosity. Otherwise, the anxiety that we feel, the fear, is going to drive the conversation and not lead, as I said, it's going to lead to either shutting down or kids' attempts to comfort you. The problem with that is often kids will say, I've heard kids say to me, kids have said to me, I don't want to approach my parents because I don't want to burden them with my feelings. The corollary to that is then they also don't want to feel like they have to take care of a parent's feelings about their feelings. So those would be two pieces of advice that I would suggest to parents. One, approach this with curiosity and avoid assumptions or judgment. Ask your kids their thoughts about why this is happening. And treating your own anxiety and fear first before having that conversation, or at least acknowledging it, to say to your child, I'm trying to approach this calmly, but, I am worried. I'd like to be able to talk with you about this, would you feel comfortable coming to me if you were feeling overwhelmed, desperate, hopeless? And again, being able to hear that without the other thing that happens that's related to anxiety is we jump to sort of anxious attempts to fix or make them feel better. And that can shut down conversations. Oh, honey, there's so much to look forward to in your life in response to hopelessness. Again, that's an effort we parents do that because we love our children. We don't like to see them suffering. And so we move in quickly to try to offer reassurance or look on the bright side of things, but it will often shut down conversation. And again, we don't fully understand what's happening. There has been research by Dr. Sunya Luthar, who's been in the area, who's talked about affluence as being a risk factor for anxiety, depression, substance abuse. And again, it often flies in the face of the belief that, how can kids be suffering when they have so much at their hands? And they do. And as I said, they often feel very guilty and not entitled to having that discomfort. So I'll end here and either pass it on to my colleagues or open things up. I'm happy to talk more about specific warning signs, and also how do we manage together the fear and anxiety of when this happens when there aren't indicators.
I think maybe I think a huge message there, obviously, being actually addressing the situation and sort of not avoiding the situation to avoid the discomfort, but actually getting into the situation, which might be a nice segue into hearing from Chelsea and Julianne about how do we have those conversations and what does that look like. So I'll turn it over to Chelsea and Julianne to talk to us about that.
Yeah, thank you, Scott and Frank. Hi, everyone. Julianne and I are from Family Centers in the Center for Hope and the Den for Grieving Kids. And we're really honored to be here with you, although deeply sorry that we have to be here. And just want to acknowledge the heaviness, right? And the pain that as a community, you guys are all going through, given all of this death recently. I think what we wanted to kind of, in talking about coming together today to have this conversation, we very much felt that it needed to be a two-part piece, right? That we needed to be able to both talk about suicide and mental health and those warning and risk factors, while also acknowledging deeply the pain and the grief that you guys as parents and as a community are feeling, and also that your children are very much likely feeling, and that the heaviness and the weight of all of this can seem insurmountable. And so I think what we want to just start with is just talking about grief, right? And this is what Julianne and I do. And so there's things that sometimes come very naturally to us in a world in which I actually don't know if we deal with grief all that well, right? I think we're taught sometimes to push grief under the rug and to not have the hard conversations and not address, and that if you Google grief, you come across the stages of grief, and if you do this and this and this, then you can just wrap it up with a bow and poof, we'll all feel miraculously better, right? And I think both that is a myth in just general grief, but especially when you have the cumulative nature of the grief in which your community is enduring. Julianne, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here. It's a really important first step to open up these conversations within our families and within our community. And before we get started, I know Chelsea touched on this, we do this for work. And so we very openly and sometimes bluntly talk about death and dying by using terms like death and dying, not passed away or lost. We believe that concrete language is really important for kids and even teenagers to fully understand. And one more language piece, just to kind of level the playing field for everyone that's here. When we talk about suicide, we really want to move away from the language of committed suicide. We're really moving towards saying death by suicide or death of suicide, like you would say this person died of or of cancer. And so taking away the language of committed is an attempt to remove the stigma around mental health and around death by suicide. And so before we start, I just always like to kind of share that in this space so we're all aware of that.
And I also think in light of these recent deaths in your community, that can be a really wonderful opening segue with your children, right? Oh, I learned this piece around language, right? And around suicide loss, right? In that we're trying to get away from this language around committing suicide to this young person died by suicide, right? It's kind of to equal that playing field and decrease stigma, which Julianne and I have felt has been very helpful in the grief work that we are doing with families in Fairfield County. So I think one of the important things to recognize in grief is that there's not a right or wrong way, right? And kind of going back to what I was saying about kind of the stages of grief and wrapping it all in a bow, and this is what you do, and this is how the responses are, and this is what it looks like. These deaths in your community are going to trigger each of you in this call differently, and your children very differently. There will be some of you on this call that are very deeply impacted because of a closeness that you had with these different families that have suffered loss in different ways, right? And there have been it's not just the suicide deaths that we're talking about, right? There have been other deaths, and I'm sure many of you have suffered your own losses in different ways over the course of this pandemic, right? So we're talking about death in general and its implications and trigger points for all of us and how that can be very, very different in each family. What we really want to focus on too is that even in an individual family, that reaction to grief can be very, very different, right? So you may have two twins, right, who may react deeply differently. One may need social supports and plans and structure, and another kid of a twin sibling, what have you, may need something that looks completely different. And I think we can sometimes prejudge what it exactly is that we want our children and ourselves, how we should react and respond to a grief situation. And I think one of the most important takeaways in terms of this grief world is almost to allow yourself to not judge that process, and that it can look very, very differently for each person in a family.
Mm-hmm. I think along those lines, Chelsea, it's also really important to note, so often we receive calls from families who have experienced a death and they're really wanting to get it right. They're wanting to have this conversation. They're wanting to relay the information the right way. They're wanting to know where to do it and how to do it and what exactly to say. And the answer to that is twofold, right? You know your child and your family members best. And so whatever we are sharing with you here tonight, you're able to take bits and pieces for whatever is going to work for your family, or as Chelsea mentioned, for each individual person within that family unit. The other thing is, I wish we were all together in the same space, because I'm sending you all just immense gratitude and so much just compassion for even coming to this space, because again, you are taking a major first step into better communicating with your child. And the biggest piece of that is the circle back. And if you are here tonight and you're hearing bits and pieces and you're like, oh my goodness, I should have said that. I wish I said that. Oh, now it's too late. It's okay. And I think probably one of the most important things we could tell you is it's really important in these circumstances to be humble and probably self-disclose a little bit more with your children than you normally and typically do. It's okay, as Frank mentioned, to say, I'm feeling anxious about this. I'm feeling really nervous, and we haven't had to have a conversation like this. And so just know it's not the only time we're going to have this conversation. And if you're needing to come back, I'm here. If I forget some things that I wanted to share with you, I'm going to come back to you as well. And it's really important to kind of keep those lines of communication open and flowing as more information comes in, as the grieving process progresses, as you find more information, as you get more comfortable as a parent having these conversations. It's so important to children to see us be able to be humble enough to come back and say, you know what? I don't know that I got that 100% right. I don't know if that really felt that great for me. And I want to come back and revisit that with you. And so I want to take a little of the pressure off, because we are going to share a lot of language and tidbits with you tonight. And if you've already had these conversations and you're feeling like now you have a long to-do list of things to say and do, you have time. You will revisit this conversation, and you will absolutely have more time to have these conversations.
And I think in conjunction with that, right, that's the grief process, right? That in some ways you're as a community in crisis, right? And sometimes we think we need to have immediate solutions to grief and crisis and trauma and terrified feelings, right? And in what we often talk about in the grief world is that this grief is going to ebb and flow and change over the coming days and the coming weeks. And the things that your children and you yourselves as parents may need are going to change, right? It's not going to be stagnant, right? The child that may not right now be able to talk because they're just trying to process, several days from now, several weeks from now, they may now want to process or talk or say something out loud. And so that piece around circling back a week from now, days from now, a week from now, a month from now, right? That's all part of this incredible, important piece, right? Because the other assumption we don't want to make here, if you're a family that is used to having really hard conversations, incredible, right? Don't stop now. If you're a family that doesn't have hard conversations or talk about deep, deep feelings and emotions and worries and fears, that's okay. But also, if you start because of this, incredible, right? But also don't expect that your children may react exactly how you want them to, right? That they may not be able to immediately open up just as we as adults and parents want them to. It's almost like you're providing the on-ramp for these conversations to begin and to flourish. You have to start them, but the expectation of the child and the teenager can't be that they're going to immediately meet you there right away, right? And that's that whole circling back and offering the space and time and time again, right? One of the things we see so much in little kids in grief is their process, and this makes sense, right? Because the developmental stage of grief for a little person is not one that really understands or accepts permanent as real, right? You know, so there's a lot of circling back and asking questions, ebbing and flowing out of grief in a very playful way, typically, right? Oh, daddy died, and then jumping into play. And in some ways, there's also some truth to this around hard conversations with teenagers, right? You're ebbing and flowing out of their capacity and their ability to have hard conversations with you guys as parents, especially if this is a new thing for you guys as family members, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's not abnormal at all. It's actually really common to have this conversation again. You know, we have families calling us that are newly bereaved and very activated and wanting to get this conversation right, because it's the hardest conversation they may ever have to have. And they're having to have it again that night, again the next day, and to process, because they need to hear this story. They need to talk about it in order to process this really big event that is happening. Even though they're teens, it is a littler body. And we don't want kids' grief to be thought of as miniature adult grief. It's actually immensely different. And they are not mini adult grievers. Children's grief is kind of its own wheelhouse. And so, yes, they're teens. Yes, we may talk to them a little bit more like our peers or have semi-adult conversations with them, but I wouldn't be super surprised if, maybe not regressing is the right word, but if you're kind of needing to share this information multiple times and have similar conversations over and over. It doesn't mean the information isn't landing or getting to them. It's just so much for them to process at this time.
And I think in that way, right, we're talking about a lot of loss here, right? In that kind of accumulation of loss, right? There's been multiple deaths in the high school, but then you're also in the context, right, of this collective loss that as society we have experienced through the course of the pandemic. So, right, going to what Frank was saying in the beginning around the mental health crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is because we've been living in this pandemic where all of our norms have changed and we've been isolated and things have, there's so many factors that go into the overwhelming feeling some of your kids may be experiencing. I also want to just say that that's normal, right? A normal reaction to grief is pain and sadness and anxiety and worry and fear, right? These are all normal reactions to a grief process. What we want to be aware of as parents is when that healthy grieving and normal grieving kind of ebbs into something that is scary or unhealthy, right? And a lot of the things that we see in terms of negative grief reactions, right, or poor coping, if you will, right, are very similar to what Frank was mentioning about risk signs and things you should be aware of just in terms of mental health, right? So in terms of grief, right, if your kids are incredibly withdrawn, right, if academics are changing, if they're not wanting to see friends, if they are not sleeping, not eating, if there's a lot of somatic symptoms, which is often incredibly tied in with grief, right? Stomach aches, nausea, headaches, right? All of these things, right, can be really signs that people are feeling the grief in ways that are not typical or, can lead to larger issues, if you will, right? That being said, each of you know your own child the best, and all of that is in the context of time and length, right? I would imagine many of you, especially in this period, are going to experience your children as having some stomach aches and headaches and sleeping disturbed, and they're wanting to either be with friends or not be with friends. There are going to be some really normal behavioral, emotional, academic challenges and differences in your children that don't mean your children are at risk, right? We also have to recognize that we're looking through a lens of fear and worry because of what's happened in your community. And so I don't want everyone to leave here and say, oh my gosh, my kid's acting different. There must be something terribly wrong here. It just means that we have to be mindful and aware, and we have to, again, circle back and open up that conversation. Are you okay? Have you ever thought about self-harming? Have you ever thought about wanting to hurt yourself, right? These are conversations that are so painful and so scary as parents to open up. But if you take anything away from this, it's that your children also sometimes need you to.
I think it's also, Chelsea, along those same lines, and Frank, I want you to get back in here, of course. It's really important to have those conversations, but focus on holding the space. And Frank, I loved what you were saying about kind of withholding judgment, being aware of our own anxiety when we're having these conversations. It's okay to take some pressure off your teen and say, it's okay. I am not going to be offended if I'm not your go-to person as your mom or as your dad or as your caretaker. It's okay if it's your best friend or even your best friend's mom or an aunt or a cousin. I just want to make sure you have someone in your life identified that you can go to if you're feeling these feelings. And naming it is not going to then cause it. Right. We often say you're never going to remind a griever about the grief that they're experiencing because it's always top of mind. Your community right now is immersed in grief and loss. It's everywhere. You having this difficult conversation with your child, you're not reminding them of anything that they're not already constantly aware of or thinking about. It's okay to be incredibly blunt and say, have you ever had thoughts of harming yourself? Have you ever had thoughts of immense sadness? Have you ever felt like you didn't want to live anymore? And those are incredibly hard questions to ask, especially as Chelsea and Frank were saying, if you're not used to having those really deep, in-depth conversations. But again, naming those things and specifically asking them is not going to cause your child any harm. It's going to open up a conversation that they're already hearing elsewhere. And if you want to be able to kind of control a bit of that narrative and make sure the conversation's happening in a safe space within your own home with people that you and your child can trust, you want to make sure we don't have control over much. Really, we don't have control over anything in this world, but you want to take a little bit of control of that conversation and narrative because they're happening. These conversations are happening, and you want to make sure that it's happening in the right space and time and place.
So I did get some questions from parents, and I'm wondering if it might be a good time to ask some of those questions that might apply to many of the people here with us today. The first question, and maybe this is maybe more to you, Julianne and Chelsea's. My child is very introverted and less open to sharing his feelings. What are some good conversation starters, in addition to asking their thoughts on why this is happening, to draw him out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good question. And I think that we are so wanting our children who are introverted and quiet and don't have the easiest time at communicating their emotions. In some ways, I think it's just giving permission to the feelings and the thoughts, and maybe naming that you too feel upset and worried and scared, and you want your child to know that you're there for them, right? I don't know if as parents we can force our kids to talk. That's the challenging thing as a parent. But I think ensuring that your child is aware that you are there and that you love them and care for them and want them to be supported. And if they have anyone, right? I don't know, Frank, if you have thoughts on that, on helping an introverted, quiet kid express.
There often some of these conversations happen, while you're driving in the car.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're not having this kind of formal face-to-face sit down that can feel very awkward and intense. Sometimes it's the conversation that you're having when you're looking out the window of the car and they're looking out the window of the car. And it helps, for more, kind of inhibited kids not to feel the intensity of that conversation. I did want to say, I see that Scott, can I respond to the question in the chat?
Sure.
From Millie.
Of course.
Yeah. So, Millie, thank you for putting that out there. It's okay for us to say we don't understand.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for 30 years working with adolescents, and I don't fully understand what their inner world is like or what's happening for them. So, when your daughter said you just don't understand, you could say, you're right. Help me to understand what it's like to be a kid now.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this happening? So that's an example of letting yourself just go with what she's offering you. She's saying you don't understand, you won't understand. The response is, I'm trying to understand. Can you help me understand what's happening? And let them, they're the adolescents are they're the ones who are speaking and telling us what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always pleasant as an adult to hear what kids are saying.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot wrong in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
And at big levels, and kids are aware of it.
And I also think there's a piece here, right, that we can't fix this for them, right? Mm-hmm. There's this sometimes as parents and helpers, and we want to fix, right? One of the biggest myths about grief, and actually some of why I love grief work the most, is as a therapist, I actually don't feel pressure to fix anyone's grief, right? I can't. I intrinsically understand that I can't take away the pain of losing a loved one, right? I can help people cope. I can open up and hold their space in their pain. And so in some ways, understanding as a parent that you can't fix this for these kids, right? But as Frank said, opening up the conversation to be one in which you invite in their experience as a teenager. It's quite different than when we were growing up, right? I can't imagine growing up in this world of stress and pressure and pandemic and academic and athletic pressures and social media. There's a lot of pressures that are very different from the world in which I grew up in. And so that relinquishing yourself of the notion that you have to fix this for your kids is a really important takeaway, because you can listen and you can open up conversation and be there for them.
I mean, one of the things I'm hearing from kids, what the pandemic did is threw in our faces the precarity of life. Right? That life is not this sort of controlled blueprint that things go according to as we hope or expect. And I think the pandemic, for all of us, showed us how precarious life can be. And we're going along and something happens and everything gets turned upside down. For kids who are already suffering from anxiety and depression, that just intensified those questions. What is the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life if you can work, and then suddenly something can happen and strip it away? The kids who, were planning on school proms and other kinds of things, normal rites of passage, and those were taken away. There are losses there, but also the bigger issue is it forced all of us to face the precarity of life in ways that, particularly in the United States, we're often protected from.
So this question, a little bit less around language, but I think maybe an important question for us to think about given our current circumstances. So the question is, I would love for the panel to address whether this is a fact or whether this is a myth, that there is that suicides have an influential ability on copycat elements with other teens navigating severe mental health issues. So I guess kind of the idea of, is it true that a suicide contagion exists as a concept? And then I guess on the flip side too, what do we see as ways to impact that trajectory?
So the answer to that is there can be a contagion effect. And in fact, it's called the Werther effect. And it applies particularly to people in the media. So my understanding is now that people in the media have a responsibility to report suicides in a way that is factual, but doesn't in any way potentially glamorize or glorify what happened. So there is something like that, particularly with the media, and where there can be a contagion effect, and it's also, it affects the way schools, how the schools have to talk about it. And a lot of schools struggle. Do we hold, Scott? I mean, Scott, you can tell me about how much emphasis do we give it? How many meetings do we have in the auditorium about it? These are the fine line between facing it, validating it, but not in any way kind of glorifying it. Is that helpful?
And I think there's a really healthy balance, because you don't want to swing totally the other way where we're compounding on that stigma of how could he do this? This is so selfish, whatever that language may be. Right. And so there's a way not to glamorize and glorify without further stigmatizing and having a really negative impact on the way in which we remember people who die by suicide. So I just really want to be aware of kind of how that swings and landing somewhere in the middle there.
All right. Helpful. Okay. Another question. I just want to make sure we get to all the questions. I know we do have a time limit here. What do we say to our children when they say after a few weeks, it seems like everything's just back to normal and nothing happened.
Mhm.
And I'm still suffering,
Mhm.
and everyone's acting like nothing happened.
Yeah. We see this a lot. Once the services wrap up and, the meal train stops coming for the family and the school stops talking about it. And it does, it feels like life moves on and the grievers are kind of stuck in the wake of this loss. Like, what are we supposed to do? And at the Den, we do a lot of memory making. We do a lot of talking about our loved ones who have died. And of course, it depends on the closeness and the proximity you've had to these losses and these deaths. But thinking of ways within your own family to acknowledge that grief and that pain. Thinking of ways to remember the people who have died within your own home and within your own family. It often does feel like people have moved on and have gone back to normal, and I'm still feeling really sad. Important to note that maybe other people are feeling that as well, and they're not sharing or talking about it.
Yeah, I would say too, I would add to that, it's another reality. Life does move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And people have different attachments to the person who died. Their grief is going to look different.
Mm-hmm.
I've also had a lot of kids say to me, I feel guilty that I'm moving on.
Yes.
Yep.
That's one of the biggest ones, I think, especially
Right.
for teenagers. There often is this question with teens, well, I want to go to my sporting
Right.
event, or I want to go to this, is it okay if I'm having fun, right? There's that. To me, that's one of the most common teenage
Mhm.
questions, because there's such guilt attached. Well, this person is no longer here. How can I go and have fun, right? In light of that.
Right.
And I think that's that other piece around not, we do a lot of comparative suffering in grief, right? We don't all feel the same and we all need different things, right? And so normalizing for your teens that it's okay to go have fun, that you both need to, in order to be resilient and to get through really hard things, you both need to allow yourself that in kind of being, you need the good to be able to sustain the pain, if that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so encouraging kids to reflect on what they need in the moment is okay, and to not guilt and shame themselves into those feelings, even though they are very normal. And that is one of the number one questions we get from teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. Can we talk at all about any sex differences between how students respond and how students both respond to the stressors and respond to grief, but also how it relates to suicide in general?
What I could say about that is that female adolescents tend to attempt suicide more often than males. Males often, and Julian, you have to correct my language on this, often complete suicide because they tend to use more lethal means of trying to kill themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, for example, that having a gun in the house, is one of the things we ask when we're doing a suicide assessment. Are there any guns in the house? That has been shown to increase the risk of completed suicide. So there are some gender differences in terms of females having more, and it might be more, they're more prone to internalizing versus externalizing behaviors, who have more attempts, but when males try it, it tends to be lethal.
I just also want to address, because there's a couple things in repetitive thoughts in the chat here around concerns around sleep and the implications that has for mental health, social media and the implications that has for health. And then also this concept of our kids are seeing suicide as normal.
626.
and it's 6:26, right? So we have 4 more minutes, and there's so much to talk about here. And we could be talking for hours and hours, but I just want to address that, of course, right? If us as adults, when we are impacted by less sleep, feel foggy and unwell, right? If that is something that is sustained in our children, of course, that's a risk factor. Sleep, social media, the implications of social media are beyond the scope of this conversations. I think we all know how dangerous social media can be, and also how positive it can be, right? But those are things I think in our families that we know, right? Sleep is absolutely a piece that we have to be aware of. No, that's okay, Krista, don't worry, I saw your chat there. But it is 6:27, so I want to be mindful of time. And I think the other thing is just, because I see this as so important to address, this idea that what you're seeing in your Darien community as normal, right? We are here as panelists and experts in mental health, in suicide, in grief, right? But in no way is what your community experiencing normal, right? Is there an uptick in mental health crisis in our nation? Absolutely, right? But we're still, this is not, and you should say this to your children, right? Just because you are surrounded by it right now in this crisis also doesn't make it normal, or that it's happening everywhere. Does that make sense, Frank? I don't know if you want, or Julian, and add to that. But I think that's
I would try to find out what does the kid mean by normal?
Yeah.
So before I go and answer that, I would probably say, well, what do you mean by normal? Do you mean it's happening with increased frequency? Right. Are you talking about people having thoughts? Which high percentage of people do have thoughts at times. That's not that unusual. So I would just try to find out what are you meaning by normal?
And also that thoughts, right, don't equate to completed suicide, right? That's the connection. That not every person that is having dark thoughts and scary thoughts completes suicide. That's a really important distinction for our teenagers to understand.
Right.
And I know I'm harping on language here, but I think we want to move away from abnormal and normal when it comes to talking about suicide and mental health, because that is further stigmatizing our kids, right? So common or uncommon, because as kids, as teens, we're all trying to be normal, right? And so if you're thinking, I'm having these sad, dark, deep thoughts, I'm not normal, you're not going to come forward and share them, perhaps. And so really being mindful of that language and how much it matters and how much it can impact teens.
I mean, what can be normalized is that when we're suffering, we want relief, particularly when we're in a lot of pain, we want relief from that pain. That's really what spurs things on. A desire to be freed from pain that feels intolerable, unbearable. And that wish to be free of that, I think probably all of us can be, at various times in our lives could relate to that. Again, it doesn't mean that's the way out. And as I said earlier, often what happens for people who attempt or complete suicide is often they're stuck cognitively between, they see only two options. They only see an option. They don't see a way out. And what they're looking at is typically an experience of feeling trapped, where either option feels horrible.
Yep. And Frank, I loved what you were saying before, and I know it's 6:30 right now, but I just want to highlight this. When someone is in such deep despair or having really difficult, hard, sad, dark thoughts, to tell them they have so much to live for is actually an incredibly overwhelming statement to make, because just as you said, Frank, that option doesn't seem great right now either. And so we often look to this toxic positivity, these silver linings, this bright side. And I hope that you leave here tonight feeling a little more comfortable in holding space for that pain and for some of those dark thoughts. Because if we are wishing them away or trying to push them away with positivity, that often can feel much more isolating. And Frank, you just said that so beautifully. So thank you for that.
So
I think the other thing I just want to acknowledge here, right, because I know we're ending, is this is a conversation that we could have for hours, right? There are so many questions, there are so many things to say, so many groups of people and triggers for each, right? There's just so much that we could talk about. What I hope the takeaway in some way is that this is an entrance point, right, to your own self-care and compassion for each other as parents in your community, but also just as a starting point in, as we said, like an on-ramp, right, to some really harder thoughts and conversations as community members, parents of teenagers, et cetera, et cetera. This 1 hour is not supposed to or couldn't possibly address all the confusion and pain and worry and fear that all of you in this call are having. We are all here and here to support you guys as a community. You can reach out to Julianne and I separately. Frank, I don't know, but I also want to acknowledge that there's no way to address everything we're all feeling, because it's just a lot. It's very, very heavy, right?
And someone did point out, we did not get into higher risk groups. And that's a whole other topic of groups of kids, the LGBTQ population, Native Americans, and in Black communities right now, suicide rates are soaring. So we did not have time to get into groups that are particularly at high risk right now.
Yeah.
So I just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And I think to both of your points, we could have this conversation for hours, and on the ground we are having that conversation for hours every day. And I do know that Mrs. Dunn pointed out at the beginning of our presentation today that she sort of organized a lot of groups to come to our aid right now, a lot of community partners, and we've been working closely with Silver Hill, with family centers, with child guidance and the mobile crisis counselors who are here on the ground with us, alongside us. And so getting this guidance from family centers who have been working with our staff to give us good language to use with our teaching staff, and people who are going to be coming in contact with students who are going through trauma they haven't experienced before, has been so helpful in having these conversations with our teachers and our child guidance and my mobile crisis counselors who are here and working with us alongside us, both face-to-face with parents and teachers and students, but also working with our administrative staff on the futures planning part, working with Frank and Silver Hill and looking at sort of our bigger picture community response. All of these people have been so essential to our response plan and how we've been able to kind of do what we call postvention and be able to work together toward developing a plan to support as many stakeholders as possible. So I do thank all of you for being here. And I do want to also let our parent community know, Chelsea, Julianne, and Frank aren't going away. Child guidance isn't going away. We're all here. And so if you have specific questions that relate to your specific child, you tried to have the conversation using some of the starters we talked about tonight, and it didn't really go as planned, and you didn't get them out of them what you thought you'd get out of them. You can use us as consults. We can help direct you to Chelsea, Julianne, and Frank, and to any of our child guidance and mobile crisis counselors to get that individual conversation about how to talk to your child or assess your child specifically. So just a big thank you to all of you for being here tonight with us.
I just want to, for one more minute, acknowledge, because there's an important comment here that I think is something we didn't mention, is that if any of your kids are coming to you saying that they are concerned about their friends, or that their friends are saying something concerning, who do you go to? Who do you tell them to tell? I don't know, Scott, if you have an answer for that internally with school or how we want to address that, but I don't want to leave that comment hanging in the wings.
Sure. Yeah. So certainly during school hours or at any time, you're welcome to connect with your child's school counselor, your school psychologist, any of the administrators at Darien High School. You're welcome to call or connect with any of us if you have a concern about your child. If you have an urgent concern about your child and you're worried about their imminent safety, we always encourage you to call 211. 211 is the mobile crisis access, and they can typically get to you within 2 hours to complete a mobile crisis assessment of your child and make sure that they're safe. So we would encourage you to use that. The mobile crisis. So when you call 211, it's called mobile crisis. The mobile crisis vendor in our area is child guidance. So you're getting clinicians from child guidance typically. those same people are here with us now. So they're very aware about what's going on in our school. They're working with us closely. They know us closely. They can get in contact with us. So, so certainly always welcome to reach out to the school. But if you need something urgently, nights, weekends, you can't get a hold of somebody at school, you can always call 211.
And I also think that if your children are concerned about a friend, right, it's not necessarily about your child, but they're concerned about a friend of theirs that is expressing something concerning. I think that goes both ways, right? You know, utilizing the school support in that way. You can also, you know, utilize 211 in the same way. I mean, so I think the message to children is don't withhold if you're concerned about a friend. Tell me as your parent. Let's talk to the school, right? Like don't keep that.
Mrs. Dunn and the
You're not going to get in trouble.
Are very adept at taking anonymous tips on concerns about other students and making sure that we can make sure that student gets assessed and is supported. So I don't know, Mrs. Dunn, if you have anything that you wanted to share.
I just wanted to say thank you again, especially to Chelsea and Frank and Julianne. You have always such a careful and caring delivery to us, to our students. You've been involved with us for years, and we appreciate your guidance and expertise deeply, and we will continue to rely on you and are so grateful to you for this evening and everything that you'll do for us, I'm sure, in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you deeply from our hearts for helping our community.
Thank you.
And to anyone who was not able to get their question answered tonight, I know I got too many in my email to answer tonight. Please reach out to us. We're here. That's what we're here for right now. We want to answer your questions and help guide you and provide you any type of individual guidance you need.
And if I can, the last thing, I think if we can just end on this notion of self-care and taking care of each other and yourselves as parents and support systems for your children. Self-care can be a really awful buzzword that I tend to hate, but I think in times of tragedy and pain and worry, it's so important to model for your children how you cope and take care of yourself in healthy, effective ways. That looks different for each of us on this call, but encouraging our kids to take care of themselves and you as parents and support systems for your families and children equally as important to really own that ability to take a step back and take care of yourself during a really tragic time in your worlds.
That's a great point and a great ending point. Thanks, Chelsea. All right, so we did record tonight, so we will be able to post this to our parent community for anybody who wasn't able to watch.
Thank you.
Right, thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.